Today's Wheelbarrow Series class is on overwintering tropical plants indoors in Kentucky. First of all, why would we want to grow tropical plants? Well, tropical plants do add a lot of color to containers and our landscapes alike. They also feature long bloom times, and many have really nice foliage. It gives us a nice, lush tropical flair to the garden, as you can see in the picture there. Some of them are expensive, especially when they get a little size on them. If you have to buy new every year, you can, pay 30 to 50 bucks per plant. It's also hard to get large plants in one season if you're buying smaller ones, so you're going to probably need to overwinter some of these to get some size on them, unless you've got, the extra money to go out and buy larger plants each season and then let them freeze. Also, a lot of these are very unusual, so we buy them for novelty, just to have some plants that are a little different in our landscape or in our containers. And also, if you're crazy like me and you love plants, it's hard sometimes to let them freeze out. So you try to bring them indoors. Sadly, I'll usually will overwinter a few of them for several seasons and then finally just get tired of them, leave them out. But some of us like to keep them around as long as we want. There's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that you have the right area for them to overwinter. There are some criteria for overwintering winter plants. You do need to ensure you have adequate indoor room and adequate lighting. That's two of the main things that most of us deal with when trying to overwinter some of these larger tropicals. You can see in this picture here, they've got a lot of light. It's a very bright room. Maybe not a lot of space, but if they love their plants, they're going to make do with what they have. Also, even shade-loving plants outdoors do appreciate the sunniest indoor areas. Full shade outside is still brighter light than what a plant indoors will get during the wintertime. You may need to remove window treatments, also curtains, even some blinds, things like that, even if they're open, can inhibit some of the light flow. So that's something you may need to consider, especially if you don't have the brightest, sunniest window to start with. A couple of other options if you don't have a really bright sunny window is you can always invest in a grow light system. Now I know a lot of these are just showing small plants and seedlings under the lights, but you can raise those lights and put larger plants under them as well. Some of these may not be maybe too expensive if you don't have a bright sunny window. But the great thing is, if you do invest in these, you can also use it to raise some seedlings in the spring, like tomatoes and peppers and those things for the garden. So you can get dual purpose out of it. The one on the right there, you can see that one's got a little cover over it, so it keeps the humidity up, and that can be an issue growing indoors, but they've got a lot of orchids and other things in there, then the higher humidity is welcome for those plants. Now is a good time to inspect your plants for insects and diseases. Go out and look for signs of any pests. We'll talk about those, what you're probably going to see in just a bit. You're going to look for chewed leaves, droopy leaves, bronzing, spots, etc. Be prepared to treat for whatever may be present because we don't want to bring these things indoors. Don't move diseased or insect-ridden plants indoors without treating first. The diseases are probably not going to be as big an issue indoors, but insect problems can be really bad indoors because there's no natural rainfall, there's no other good beneficial insects in there to help keep them under control, no birds. So you can get those insect pests can get out of hand pretty quickly. Also, it's not uncommon for insect problems to pop up later indoors. I've had some problems. Sprayed the plant was fine. Come January, all of a sudden you have this huge infestation of spider mites. So just you're gonna have to keep an eye on these during the winter time just to make sure you don't end up with some problems later on in the winter. Generally, diseases, again, are not as big a problem as the insects are going to be indoors. So what pests are we probably going to really have to watch for that can be really a problem indoors? Well, some of these are probably not as huge an issue when they're outdoors, but they can become huge issues indoors. First one on the top left, those are mealybugs outdoors. There may be a few on the plant, but the plant never even really suffers from it, and the populations don't build up. But indoors, with no rainfall and no beneficial insects, we can get a huge problem with those. They have that cottony mass on their backs, and which makes them really hard for most of our insects to get to them. That's why they're a really big problem on house plants or indoor plants. You can see in the middle picture there, there's a little webbing from spider mites. Those are going to be a huge issue if you've got plants with spider mites. It's almost impossible to control spider mites indoors. Sometimes it may be worth just getting rid of that plant and starting over. And then the next there on the right upper, that is brown soft scale. Another one of those, if it's on a plant outdoors, you probably won't even notice it. It's indoors whenever it becomes a problem and it really starts to affect the plant's health. And it's got a little waxy coating over each one of those little insects that are stuck to the leaf, which also makes it hard for the insecticide to get in contact with the actual insect to kill it. Bottom left there, that's white flies. That's usually only a problem in greenhouses because they don't overwinter here outdoors in Kentucky. But again, if you've got some on a plant, say you bought a plant, you brought it home, and it had spider mites outside, you didn't really pay any attention to it. The plant didn't seem to suffer too bad. You brought them in, you're going to get a big population explosion, and your plant's really going to suffer. So be sure you keep an eye out for those. And those are really small. They look bigger in that picture than they actually are. And then the bottom right there, that's fungus gnats. That's going to be usually from your soil, especially if it's a plant that's kind of been in a moist soil for a long time, or you've got some moss, those kinds of things in there. They don't really damage the plants too much. They may feed on the roots a little bit, but they will be flying in the house and kind of are annoying and something that you probably don't want to bring indoors. But sometimes we can control that just by letting the soil dry out a little bit. So what do you do if you do have bugs on your plants? There's several things that we can do depending on what the insects are. For the spider mites, there's not a cheap option. You can spray water under the leaves 3 days in a row, just to upset their mating, and then you can spray with an insecticidal soap, which would help kill a few of them. But you're probably going to have to do that a few times during the winter to keep the spider mite population down. A better option would probably be floramite there. You can see on the top right, but that's pretty expensive. It kills spider mites pretty well, but doesn't kill the spider mites that eats other spider mites, so that's good. But it's very expensive, like maybe a couple $100 for a pint. So maybe if you had some friends that you could share it, that'd be a good option. But the great thing about it is you only use about a quarter of a teaspoon to a gallon of water. Other options, if you've got maybe the soft scale or the mealybugs, you can use the rose and flower insect killer there. That actually is systemic from Bayer, and it soaks into the plant and actually will kill anything that's eating on the plant, which is a great option for a tropical plant or something that we're not going to consume any parts of the plant ever. Other things there's a garden safe houseplant and garden insect killer. There's several brands of that out there on the market. Its active ingredient is a pyrethrum, which it is a knockdown. So if you can spray it directly on an insect, it'll kill it. That's not going to work very well on the mealybugs and the soft scale because of their covering. So you're going to need something systemic like the Bayer Advanced Rose and Flower Insect Killer. The active ingredient in some of those is imidacloprid. Several varieties out there that have that in it. Sometimes it's a soil drench, and you just pour it into the pot, and it soaks up to the plant and kills them. So there's a lot of options out there, but basically, if you don't really see that much or any insects, and you just want to give it a good clean, I would go ahead and do the insecticidal soap anyway, because it also, after you spray the plants off, spray with that and spray it, rinse them off. You have a nice, clean plant as well. You know, some of the dust and stuff off of it, spray it with the water hose 3 days in a row too. And then give it a spray with insecticidal soap, which will just kill anything maybe that's attached that it can cover over, and actually it kills by suffocating the insects because they can't breathe with the soap over their breathing orifice on their bodies. We pretty much just said this, but whether you find bugs or not, go ahead and treat with something like a pyrethrum and insecticidal soap. I really like the insecticidal soaps for that because it doesn't have any smell to it really, and it's not anything that's really toxic at all. Just know that again, your insect populations can increase pretty quickly indoors, so keep it on your plants. I've noticed that getting outbreaks of spider mites up into January was not uncommon because they stayed in the house, it's warm, and then their population increased pretty quickly. Again, spray your plants down with water 3 days in a row, upper and lower leaves. That's just going to knock down any insects and disrupt breeding and egg laying to reduce your populations. And then you can spray with something like insecticidal soap. Also, it's a good idea to wash your pots too. I have brought, believe it or not, masses or egg sacs in from spiders, and I didn't know it. And in the middle of winter, all of a sudden the spiders are hatching and you've got hundreds of little baby spiders. So it's good to go ahead and wash that pot down and make sure you're knocking any of those egg masses off the pot. So when do you want to start bringing in your tropicals or start acclimating them? Whenever we start getting temperatures down in the 50s, believe it or not, that can even shock or cold damage some of the tropical foliage. Uh, Once night temps consistently drop in the 50s at night, it's time to start acclimating these plants. You can see there in the picture there, that is a ficus, and that's cold damage. And that cold damage can happen down in the low 50s and even into the 40s. We don't have to have a frost for these plants to damage. They're from tropical regions, and they're just not used to those temperatures, and they can damage pretty easily. So if you want to acclimate your plants, you want to move your sun-loving plants gradually to the full shade over about 5 days. Basically, you're just going to reduce the amount of sun daily until you get them into a more of a shade area because they've been in the full sun. So, gradually bring them. If you've got a shade tree nearby, you can move the pot every day closer to the complete shade under that tree, or you can even move it slowly under the porch. Once sun-loving plants are in full shade, you want to follow the shade-loving steps for them as well. And the shade-loving plants, you want to move those also gradually indoors over 5 days, because remember, it's a lot less light indoors than it is even in the shade outdoors. So you're going to reduce the amount of light for them daily until they come indoors. Now, what this is going to do is help these plants not get shocked as much as they would if they just came directly indoors, which hopefully will reduce the amount of leaf drop that's going to happen whenever they come indoors. But you will get leaf drop. That's just going to happen. So you want to position your sun-loving plants so that they receive the maximum amount of light they can each day indoors. Obviously, that's going to be much less than what they had outside, but hopefully you can get enough to keep these plants alive and maybe not looking too terrible by the time winter's over and it's time to go back out. Shade-loving plants will grow well indoors. However, they can survive lower light levels, so give the full sun and the most light to the full sun plants. Give them some priority for that, and then the lower light ones they may not be happy with less light than the directly into the window, but they will survive the lower light much better than the sun-loving plants will. Again, your plants will drop leaves. Don't worry about that. Hopefully, acclimating them will help. But generally, you have a couple of weeks of cleanup after you bring them in because they'll turn yellow and drop quite a few leaves. That's not uncommon at all. Your tropical plants, or any house plant for that matter, is not going to use as much water indoors as it would outside because it's just not as actively growing. So when to water? Well, fill into your container, and if the top 2 to 3 inches of soil feels dry, then it's a good time to go ahead and give them a drink of water. Be sure that you have a saucer or something under the pot to catch excess water. And if you're going to overwinter succulents, even though they're frost sensitive, you can do that, and you don't have to water those near as much, obviously. A lot of succulents I've brought in, like aloes and things, may not have watered them the entire winter. They look kind of scraggly by spring, but they're just fine. They go outside, they get watered well, and they pop right back, looking like they did whenever they went back into the house. Generally, no fertilizer is needed during the wintertime. The plants aren't really growing. We kind of just trying to hold them in that kind of a state of almost dormancy, or just sitting there. But if you've got a good window and things are growing a little bit, you can give them a half-strength fertilizer maybe once a month, just to keep them from having any issues fertility-wise. Also, if you'd like, you can also put a couple drops of peppermint oil in your water. If you want a nice peppermint scent in the house, you can do that. You can also do another type of oil, but just a couple drops, not a lot, because the oil is not necessarily the great thing for your plants. The goal is to keep them alive until spring, so don't worry if they look bad. Sometimes they may not even but be maybe 2 or 3 inches of green leaves on the tips of the stems. That's fine. All we're trying to do is overwinter these. Generally, we're not going to worry about how they look as long as they stay alive. Now, if you're somebody that wants them to look great, you better have a really sunny window or an area or sun porch or something that you can give them the maximum amount of light. Because remember, in the wintertime around here, we don't have very many sunny days to start with, and then when you're indoors and it's cloudy outside, it's just not a lot of light. Humidity can be a big issue indoors because our houses are very dry in the wintertime, and these are tropical plants, remember, so they come from a hot, humid location, and they're going to go into, a cool, dry heat in your house. So you can get some leaf tip burns or some curl of the leaves because of lower humidity. So to raise the humidity, you can mist your plants a little bit. You can also place them in more humid rooms, such as kitchens and bathrooms, if that's possible. Also, another way to do that to increase your humidity is set some little pans of water next to the plant. If you have a container like this, you can put a few pebbles, put some water in it, and you can get a little humidity from that as it evaporates. And then also put a bunch of plants together, several plants in one location or in one room can actually increase the humidity around the plants themselves. If there are several plants located close to each other, they'll give off moisture and actually raise the humidity in that area as well. But most of our houses in the wintertime are very dry. You could also run a humidifier if you'd like. It's not a bad idea for us either, for that matter. Here's just grouping your plants together in a room that can raise your humidity. And this is a beautiful room here, and you can see that it's a very sunny room, so it's a great place for plants. If you have something like that, that would be ideal, but most of us don't have that. But this is just a nice picture. I thought it was neat to see. But they did put a lot of plants in one room. Obviously, if some of us plant nuts like me had that room, you probably wouldn't see anything but plants in it. Be a great area to overwinter plants. Foliage plants are probably the easiest to overwinter and generally need the least amount of light. A lot of these were understory plants in the tropics anyway. Some of the examples of this are fiddle leaf figs, crotons, pothos, philodendrons, sansevieria, spider plants, and a lot of those, are considered just regular house plants for a lot of people anyway. But if you want, you can take these indoors and bring them outdoors in the summertime, which I like to do with most of my house plants anyway. But you can get a lot of leaf colors and leaf textures with these foliage plants. Now they do drop leaves whenever they come in, but generally they don't need as much light to start with because they're foliage plants, not flowering plants. So they're a lot easier to bring them in and let them drop leaves and still have a plant that's ready to go back outside whenever spring gets here. But they are really nice, and if you can keep them growing actively or holding on to those leaves, and give you some color indoors as well. And obviously, succulents are by far the easiest plants to overwinter because most of them don't have actual leaves that they drop. They also can go pretty dry, sometimes even the entire winter indoors without being watered. And they can also take lower temperatures without going into shock, sometimes down into even the low 40s. It's better to underwater these than it is to overwater them. That's sure far way to kill a succulent indoors just so that they have wet feet. So just keep that in mind. Maybe water once a month a little bit and just let them run on the dry side until spring and they'll be just fine. Here we have the flowering plants are the hardest to overwinter successfully because they like temperatures between 60s and 70 degrees. They want a little bit higher humidity, 30 to 40%. And ideally, these plants will be placed in naturally humid rooms. If not, again, you're going to have to raise that humidity around these plants because they can get some leaf drop or some leaf curl or burn from the humidity being too low. To keep the plants basically looking decent, you want to keep that temperature at 50 degrees at night, 65 degrees, 70 degrees during the daytime. Now, obviously, we're not going to have that fluctuations in our house, so we're going to probably stick around 70 degrees. Just know that if you have a higher temperature, maybe you have a warmer room or an area that next to the fireplace or something like that, and it's warmer, you're going to get some leggy growth. So if you can keep them running a little bit on the cooler side, you'll be a little happier with their growth. They maybe won't get leggy. Also, flowering plants can be allowed to go dormant, which kind of mimics the dry season in the tropics when they just kind of sit there. If you want to do that, if you have an unheated basement or a room that's really cool, you need something between 40 and 50 degrees. Kind of water them, just keep enough to keep the plant alive, and they can sit there basically in a dormant type of state until spring. So they really don't need a lot of light. They really don't need a lot of water. They just kind of hang out there. For me, it is with these flowering plants, don't worry if they look bad as long as they're alive because once they go outside, they'll take right back off growing again and look great. Some plants, such as flowering plants, will need a bit of pruning to retain their shape because they can get out of hand when they grow a lot in the summertime. Something like the hibiscus down the bottom left, it can benefit from as much as a 50% pruning. So you can cut these back pretty hard before you bring them in. That will also reduce the amount of leaf drop that you're going to have to deal with inside because you're going to go ahead and prune that out. Now your mandevilla, there on the right, or your jasmine or your bougainvillea is in the middle. They may respond to a little bit of pruning as well, 25% pruning. You can probably go harder than that on these if you need to. It's not going to hurt them. They just may go in a little more shock when you do that, but it won't hurt them. They're used to being cut back. It's not be like it's gonna kill them. Citrus, if you have some oranges or something like that growing in containers, sometimes we have to prune those just to keep them to a manageable size for indoors. Just know that if you trim a little of those out, it's not going to hurt the plant at all either. Especially if it's going to, if it's too big to come indoors and you have to cut it back, then obviously cutting it back is better than leaving it outside to freeze. Few tips. Don't be alarmed if many of your overwintering tropicals again will look like dormant sticks by midwinter. It's not a problem as long as you scratch that cambium, that bark and that cambium layer and they're still green. They're just fine. A lot of your tropical plants will actually shut down to an almost dormant state anyway because the short, dark winter days are, not conducive to them growing anyway. That happens. That's not a problem at all either. Just reduce your watering up to the point that they die, but they're not actually growing or they're just shut down. They don't need a lot of water, but you just want to make sure you keep them hydrated that way. Also, if you have any questions, you can always call me here at the Washington County Extension Office. And, it's gardening, it's bringing plants indoors. So, finally have fun. If you lose a plant, it's not a big deal. You can buy another one in the spring. But just know that if whatever you do over winter, you're saving money for the next spring where you can buy more plants. Again, if you have any questions, you can call me at the Washington County Extension Office at 859-336-7741. Happy gardening.